major differences between the natives and the English who came over here along with some of the Dutch was their weaponry, which you've seen us fire just a moment ago, and their defensive armor. People had been wearing armor in Europe and on the continent for over 2,000 years. Some of it originally was made out of bone, then bronze, then chainmail, and all types of other types of metal. What we're going to do now is a gentleman is going to put on armor just as they would have worn in Europe during this time, and then we're going to demonstrate what a person would have worn here in Virginia. Can I have you step forward? This is the man we're going to arm. All the armor that a man wore had to hang off of one thing. It was called a gorget by the English, a gorget by the French. And we're going to go ahead and put on his gorget. Can you take off your sword? This year his hair is a little shorter than it was last year, so it won't get caught in the armor. Believe me, it does. This wraps around the neck and protects the neck, but it also is a place where all the other armor hangs off so it won't dig into your body. A lot of times when a man wore armor, yesterday I wore some armor and I had a vest on like this. I got home, I found spots all over my shirt. I looked and I had places where it cut into my side. The armor is not that heavy. It's hot in Virginia, and it also will dig into you if you don't have proper undergarments or padding. The next thing that we're going to put on this man is the cuirass, or the breastplate, and backplate. All parts of this armor, when they went to make spacesuits for people going into outer space, one of the things they studied was how armor articulated. Because a lot of men in armor can actually do somersaults, or cartwheels, excuse me, wearing armor. And it's important that the armor fits you well, and this is the type of armor that a gentleman would wear in the field. You can see an armor like this almost always took more than one person to help. You needed somebody to help put the armor on. It's got all kinds of little things, like these little things here that lock the armor in are called snag hooks. They're just simple little hooks, but they were called snag hooks. You can't hook up both sides, just let it go. All right, the next thing we're going to try to arm is his arms. Now we have right here two pieces. We have something, the pauldrons. And you'll see the pauldrons have a front and a back. It has a turning joint in there, just like a spacesuit would have later. So that way when you're wearing it, you can turn your arm. this man has on is called a half armor. People in Virginia often wore a half armor. This is something that could have been worn in Virginia, but probably was not worn very often because it really restricts your movement. No, you don't need that. And his helmet, you'll see, has an open face on it, which allows him to breathe a lot more easily. It's called an open-faced bourgogne, which is another French word that the English decided not to change much. Now, he's half armored right now. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take off these things called tassets. You see how long this all takes. So, you would have to, has everybody heard of something called a squire? You would almost have to have a squire or someone to help you to assemble this armor. Most armors have all types of pieces. An armor like this would have usually another breastplate that would go over top of it with some halt guards if you were jousting or something like that to keep lances from hitting you in the face. You would have a different type of helmet. It was called a garniture. An armor like this, a fine armor for the field, would cost about the same as a Mercedes-Benz would today. It was very, very expensive, and not many people other than a real gentleman would have such a suit of armor. You can't clamp his legs on with it. It wraps around his knees. Last was actually his face piece, because in Virginia one of the things that really happens is when it's so humid here, it's usually about 20 degrees warmer in Virginia. If you go to England this time of year, it's barely usually up in the 70s, not much more. But here, it would get a lot hotter and a lot more humid. If you put that face guard on and start breathing your own air back in, believe me, it can get very hot very quickly. So we're only going to leave this on for just a moment. This face guard was made so that when the man in England was riding, it's got a couple of little points here that I can hit this and make it collapse down so you can close it. You have a man who is fully armed, the way if someone would fight on horseback in the field, and at about the time of Henricus, around 1611. However, what started happening is that you saw our display of weaponry a moment ago. Well, in England and all over Europe, people were developing firearms, and it made the breastplate, the rod, had to be so thick that it was no longer practical to wear. So people began paring down some on the armor. And gentlemen on horseback would be dressed more like this person right here. You see, he has a fine-looking European-styled helmet. Came from the eastern part of Europe. It's called a lobster tail helmet. It's got a neck guard in the back that articulates. It's open in the front face. He also has a sliding guard that can come down across his nose. So if a saber cut comes across his face, it will protect him somewhat. But he's able to hear a lot better. You'll see that right now he's got holes right here, and so he can hear when he's going. He's carrying a pistol. He's got a blackened breastplate on. Okay, so this is an excellent armor. This is a type of armor that would have been used a little bit later on what's called the English Civil War, and later, and used all over Europe. It's an excellent armor. You'll see instead of having these greaves or the lower parts of the armor, he's got heavy boots on. So this became much more practical than what this man's wearing. And believe me, you would have been really out of place in the New World with either of these armors on, really, especially this one, because early on there weren't that many horses here. And if you had a horse, there weren't many places to ride them because there weren't trails. Most of the trafficking was done in the river, on the river. This man right here is dressed more like someone in Virginia. You'll notice that his armor, his munitions grade, it's been proof tested. The word proof testing came from this. Somebody shot at it. The bullet did not go through. It would turn an arrow every time. Most of the wounds on settlers were in their arms, legs, and especially in their throats and faces. But still, this man could fight a lot better. He could run a lot faster. He could load his weapon better because he's still going to be firing a musket with this type of armor on. Oftentimes he would have tassets hanging down or something called a quilted base, which was made out of fabric that would turn an arrow. So even though the natives were excellent fighters, because of this armor and because of the weapons, these men of steel became almost invincible. Now there's a couple of things that they met over here early on in Jamestown that this armor would not protect you against. What do you think they would be? Mosquitoes, brackish water, starvation, the heat. So soon after getting here, John Smith said they had much more cuirasses and helmets than they had people, because people died off and their helmets stayed and everything stayed around. Now also in Virginia, this is much more practical because it's been painted. It's so humid here, this armor would rust quickly if it was not tended on a daily basis. And also if you were out and about, you need to take this off. If you were out and about with this outfit on, you know, it would be really hard to hide. You're very, very obvious, you know, it's hard to, especially on a sunny day. The worst part about wearing this type of armor in Virginia is not, once again, the weight of it, but it's how well it fits your body so it doesn't dig into places. and how hot it gets while you're wearing it. But you were required to wear armor early on whenever you went out into the field, and people practiced with the armor on, so that way when it came time to fight, they would be able to be practiced in it. However, there was another type of armor. Can I get you to step forward, sir? There were other types of armor, and a lot of times if you go into museums now, you'll see armor that was made for gentlemen. Could I get you to bring forward that shield, please? Armor became so popular that during the Victorian age, which was in the early 1800s, that there was a resurgence in the interest in armor, and people wanted to put suits of armor in all their buildings and everything like that. But even in the late 17th century, men would have had armor that looked like this. This is etched armor. This is a type of armor a lot of times you see in a museum. And if you'll see that the helmet also is etched. Both of these, this piece and this piece, are both a couple hundred years old. They're not really from the time of the 17th century, but they were made, 200 years ago anyway. You'll see that this helmet, even though it's functional, it's an open-faced burgundy, it's also it's in gray, it's etched as this breastplate, as this target is. Most targets you'll see against the tent over there are just blackened metal that would protect you from an arrow or a sword blow or anything like that. So unfortunately, a lot of the armor that you see in museums is more armor like this, whereas this type of armor this gentleman's wearing, and he's wearing, and even he's wearing, it's a type of armor that men would have actually gone out and fought in. Now, this man's armor, if I can take this light, has another function. If I'm out, if you'll notice, I have no chevrons, I have no captain's emblems. People could tell who you were by the way you dressed, if you were an officer. This man is an officer, and you can tell why, because he's got an officer's gorget. You can see that this is it's not just etched, it's actually embossed with this figure, which is even harder to do. So that makes him right away, it has very little function. Later they became even smaller, so they were almost the size of, like a small plate or something like that. And they were used all the way up through the Revolutionary War. But it shows to everybody else that this is an officer. And this simply means he's an officer. And in Virginia, and just about anywhere, war, after all, was for vain people. And vanity was important on the battlefield. How men looked, how men dressed, made a difference to them and how they fought. And that's what warfare was all about back in those days. So this is the way a man shall be armed. Now, let me ask you, all right, by a raise of hands, who would like to be dressed like this man on a hot day in Virginia? How about this man? How about this man? Well, how about this man? There you go, yeah. So armor, during the time of Henricus, like I said, armor was very popular. Armor that could no longer be used in Europe because it would not turn a bullet was very functional against native arrows. So it was armor that was not being used in Europe, oftentimes was shipped to the New World and distributed. Sometimes we have a gentleman here who actually brings some chainmail. They wore chainmail here in Virginia that hadn't been popular with European armor for over 100 years or so. So, does anybody have any questions about any of these men and their armor?
Was the armor made to fit certain size individuals?
There were two types of armor. There was the type of armor like this armor that would have been made for a man. Oftentimes it could be made in Italy or Germany. Germany for Gothic armor, later Italy for armor like this. And then finally, Henry VIII brought his own armorers to England. They had a Greenwich style armor. This armor was made for a man, just not that man. This armor is called a munitions armor. Pretty much everybody during that time, we didn't really have the same variety we have nowadays in sizes. And especially if you came to Virginia and stayed here for a while, if you were overweight a bit, you wouldn't be once you were here for a while. This is a munitions grade armor, which means it would be in a building somewhere, in an armory, and you would go in and you would grab it off the rack and you would put it on. Pretty much like a World War II helmet or like the helmets they use nowadays. So this armor, blackened from the hammer, is a lot different and a lot less expensive. It's very cheap. This armor is very expensive. This would be made for the man. This would just be made for any man. Exactly. Usually, if you look at armors, usually armors were gifts to people. So it might have been commissioned by, say, your father, like King James might have commissioned. He commissioned armors for Henry, Henricus was named after, or his son Charles I. There are beautiful armors that came to Virginia not too long ago that were made by them, but they were not only engraved and embossed and etched, but they were also gilded. They had gold all over them. So, you know, the level of gold and the vanity, once again, was, extraordinary. Any other questions? Yes. These, well, if I'm hitting a man on top of the head with a sword, basically what you want to do is keep the sword as far away from you as you possibly can. If you ever take if you take a piece of Reynolds or any type of metal and you lay it flat and you hit it, it bends. But if you put form to it and creases in it, it gives it more strength. This crest would allow the sword to glance off. Everything about this armor is supposed to try to have things glance off of it. Like I said, if he was fighting in a tournament, we have something here called a hook guard. Come up like this, at least on this side, and you have a little piece right here to hold the lance. And all the armor was designed so that things would hopefully glance off of it. And so you would, the whole point was is you wanted to be able to wear the armor another day. Yes. Well, basically in Virginia, this would be it. Other than your bandolier, which we were wearing, your musket, your sword, and a lot of times there would be something like, pretty much like the tassets we had earlier. Yeah. Something like this. Yeah, something like this would be hanging off of here, but probably painted black. Or what was more common in Virginia, because it was more practical, they would take several layers of linen, make it really thick, quilt it together, sometimes even put little pieces of metal in it, and you would call it a quilted base, hang down almost like a skirt. You turn an arrow and everything. It was a lot easier to use. You sit around and make it yourself. Now, in Virginia, the armor that was worn in Virginia was not made in Virginia. I don't know if anyone ever made armor in Virginia until a few years ago when they made it for reenactors. This armor was made by, this is not an original armor, it was made by one of the finest armorers in the country who passed away several years ago. And he used, he actually went to museums and made line drawings and things like that, so he could make an armor almost exactly like something in a museum, other than for all the etching and all that stuff. Oh, probably about 50 pounds. It's not really that heavy, and if you get it and you wear it, it's not hard to wear. As long as it doesn't dig into your body, and as long as you can move, as long as it has a turning point, like right here, to turn. And once again, a lot of it has to do with your fit. That helmet is not as heavy as the helmet that's worn by a Marine right today. Okay, that's not as heavy as a Kevlar helmet, is it?
I
went to an event one time and had a helmet, and a Marine came in and we tried them both, and his helmet weighed more. But his helmet also was better. But so it was not really the weight of it so much. It was, once again, how well you could move in it, whether or not it dug into you anywhere, and how hot it is. Any other questions?